The call to adventure. Every culture, every mythology, every tradition tells stories of heroes, figures who leave the familiar world, face terrible dangers, overcome impossible obstacles, and return transformed with gifts for their community. Odysseus, Gilgamesh, Buddha, Christ, Arjuna, Inanna. These names span cultures and millennia, but they share a pattern, a structure that Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey, a narrative so universal that it must represent something fundamental about human psychology, about the challenges consciousness faces, about the process of becoming fully human. Carl Jung understood the hero as an archetype, a primordial image living in the collective unconscious, representing the ego's struggle to free itself from the unconscious, to establish independence, to face the forces that would keep consciousness undeveloped. The hero is not simply a character in stories, but a pattern of psychological development, a map of the journey every human must make, from dependence to autonomy, from innocence to experience, from unconsciousness to awareness. But the hero archetype is dangerous as well as necessary. It can inflate the ego, can create identification with specialness, can lead to the belief that one is exempt from human limitation. The shadow of the hero is the false hero, the one who seeks glory rather than service, who needs to be special rather than to serve something larger, who mistakes the performance of heroism for its substance. Understanding the psychology of the hero means understanding both its necessity and its danger, both the developmental stage it represents and the trap it can become, both the genuine heroism that serves life and the false heroism that serves only ego. This is the hero within us all. The nature of the hero, more than courage. The hero is not defined by physical bravery or by victory in battle, though these may be part of the hero's story. The hero, in its archetypal sense, is defined by willingness to face what must be faced, to go where others will not go, to confront the dragon that guards the treasure, to descend into the underworld and return. The hero is the one who says yes to the journey even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the cost may be everything. Jung understood the hero as representing the ego's struggle to differentiate itself from the unconscious, to establish conscious identity separate from the collective, to claim individual existence. In early development, consciousness is merged with the unconscious, is identified with the mother, with family, with group. The hero's journey is the process of separation, of establishing boundaries, of saying, I am not you, I am myself, I must find my own path. This separation is terrifying because it means leaving safety, leaving the known world, leaving the protection of the collective. The call to adventure is the call to leave home, to abandon the familiar, to venture into territory where the old rules do not apply, and where one must rely on resources not yet tested. Most people refuse the call when it first comes, prefer the security of the known even when the known has become confining, even when continued existence in the familiar has become a kind of death. But the hero accepts the call, crosses the threshold, enters the forest where the paths are not marked, where danger is real, where there are no guarantees of return. This crossing is what distinguishes the hero from those who remain in the village, from those who live conventional lives, from those who never venture beyond what is safe and known. The hero must also face enemies and obstacles, must overcome forces that would prevent the journey's completion. These enemies are not arbitrary. They represent psychological resistances, internal forces that prefer unconsciousness to consciousness, that prefer dependence to autonomy, that prefer the safety of the known to the danger of growth. The dragon guarding the treasure is not external enemy, but internal resistance, the part of the psyche that does not want to change, that fears the transformation the journey requires. Understanding the hero means recognizing that the journey is ultimately internal, that the monsters are psychological, that the treasure being sought is not external reward but internal transformation, not possession but becoming. The hero's journey, the pattern of transformation. Joseph Campbell identified the monomyth, the single story told 1,000 ways across cultures, what he called the hero's journey. The pattern is remarkably consistent. The hero receives a call to adventure, initially refuses, meets a mentor who provides guidance, crosses the threshold into the special world, faces trials and enemies, reaches the innermost cave where the ultimate ordeal awaits, dies and is reborn, seizes the treasure, and returns to the ordinary world transformed, bringing gifts that benefit the community. This pattern is not arbitrary cultural invention but reflects the structure of psychological transformation itself. The call to adventure represents the moment when the old life no longer works, when consciousness recognizes that it must change or stagnate. The refusal of the call represents resistance, the ego's fear of transformation, the preference for familiar suffering over unknown possibility. The mentor represents the self in Jungian terms, the deeper wisdom that guides development, the aspect of psyche that knows the path even when the ego does not. Crossing the threshold means committing to change, means leaving behind the safety of the known, means accepting that there is no return to who one was before the journey began. The trials represent the challenges consciousness must overcome to develop, the tests that reveal whether the hero has the qualities needed to continue. Each trial strips away something false, something that seemed necessary but is actually obstacle, something that must be surrendered for transformation to occur. The innermost cave, where the supreme ordeal occurs, represents the confrontation with what is most feared, with the shadow in its most concentrated form, with death itself, whether literal or psychological. This is the crisis point, where the hero must die to the old self so the new self can emerge, where the ego must be sacrificed so that something larger can be born. The treasure seized is not material wealth but psychological gold, the integration of what was split off, the reclaiming of rejected capacities, the achievement of a more complete and more conscious way of being. And the return to ordinary world represents the necessity of bringing the transformation back to everyday life, of serving the community with what has been learned, of living the new consciousness rather than simply achieving it in isolation. This pattern repeats throughout life at different levels. Each developmental stage requires its own hero's journey, its own leaving home, its own trials, its own death and rebirth, its own return with new capacities. The shadow and the monster, what the hero must face. In every hero myth there is a monster, the dragon guarding the treasure, the minotaur in the labyrinth, the demon king, the evil sorcerer, the giant, the serpent. These monsters appear as external enemies, as threats that must be defeated through strength or cunning or courage. But Jung understood that the monster is not external but internal, is the shadow in projected form, is the rejected and denied aspects of the hero's own psyche that must be confronted and integrated. The dragon hoarding gold represents the unconscious holding captive, the psychological treasures the ego needs for development. The gold is not literal wealth, but symbolic of psychological capacities that have been locked away, that cannot be accessed until the dragon is faced. Slaying the dragon does not mean destroying the shadow, but means confronting it, means making conscious what has been unconscious, means integrating rather than continuing to repress. This is why the hero often discovers unexpected connections to the monster. The enemy is revealed as brother, as father, as former friend, as aspect of a divided self. Luke Skywalker discovers Darth Vader is his father. The hero realizes the monster they have been fighting is not truly other but is intimately connected to themselves, reflects something they have denied, carries something they need to reclaim. The battle with the monster is therefore not simply conquest but confrontation leading to integration. The hero must face the monster, must risk death in the encounter, must be strong enough not to be destroyed. But the ultimate victory is not killing the monster, but transforming the relationship to what the monster represents, making conscious the projections, reclaiming the rejected capacities. Sometimes the myths make this explicit. Perseus does not simply kill Medusa, but uses her severed head as weapon, integrating the monster's power, rather than simply destroying it. Theseus enters the labyrinth, confronts the Minotaur, and emerges transformed. Beowulf fights Grendel, then Grendel's mother, then the dragon, each representing progressively deeper levels of shadow material that must be confronted. The danger is literal interpretation, believing the monster is truly external enemy that must be destroyed. This leads to projection of shadow onto others, to designating individuals or groups as monstrous, to attempting to eliminate evil in the world while remaining unconscious of evil within oneself. True heroism requires recognizing the monster as mirror, as revealing what we have rejected, as pointing toward what must be integrated. The hero and sacrifice, death and rebirth. At the heart of every hero's journey is sacrifice, the giving up of something essential, the death of who one was so that who one might become can emerge. The hero must descend into the underworld, must be swallowed by the whale, must hang on the cross, must face death in some form, whether literal or symbolic. This death is not punishment but necessity, not failure but the essential passage through which transformation occurs. Jung understood this as the death of the ego, not the elimination of ego but the surrender of ego's claim to be the center of the psyche, its willingness to serve something larger, rather than demanding that everything serve it. The ego must die to its identification with the persona, to its belief that it controls consciousness, to its insistence on remaining as it is. This death feels like annihilation because the ego experiences letting go as ceasing to exist. What the hero must sacrifice varies, but always involves what is most precious, what the ego most wants to keep. Abraham must be willing to sacrifice Isaac. Christ must give up his life. Buddha must leave his palace and family. Inanna must hang naked and dead in the underworld for 3 days. The sacrifice is never easy, never comfortable, never something that can be bypassed or avoided through cleverness or strength. This is why the hero's journey requires courage of a particular kind, not the courage to fight enemies, but the courage to surrender, not the courage to maintain control, but the courage to let go, not the courage to assert the ego, but the courage to allow the ego's death. Many who would face physical danger without hesitation cannot face this psychological death, cannot surrender the ego's claim, cannot allow themselves to be transformed. The rebirth that follows is not return to what was before, but emergence of something new, someone who has died and been reborn, who has passed through the underworld and returned, who has been dismembered and reassembled. The resurrected hero is not the same person who began the journey, but someone transformed through the ordeal, someone who has integrated what was learned through suffering, someone who has claimed capacities that could only be gained through sacrifice. This pattern of death and rebirth repeats throughout life. Each major transition requires letting go of old identity, dying to who we were, being reborn as someone new. The hero archetype teaches that this process, however painful, is necessary for growth, for development, for becoming fully human. The false hero, inflation, and the dark side. The hero archetype has a shadow, a dark side that emerges when the ego identifies with the archetype rather than relating to it consciously. This is what Jung called inflation, when the ego believes itself to be the hero rather than recognizing that it is playing the hero's role temporarily, when it confuses performing heroic acts with being special, when it needs to be seen as heroic rather than to serve what the heroic journey serves. The inflated hero believes they are exceptional, exempt from human limitation, destined for greatness, superior to others. They seek glory rather than service, recognition rather than contribution, the appearance of heroism rather than its substance. They need enemies to defeat, need dragons to slay, need to prove themselves rather than to develop themselves. The journey becomes performance rather than transformation, becomes about ego gratification rather than ego sacrifice. This false heroism appears everywhere in modern culture. The person who needs to be the savior in every relationship, who creates crises so they can rescue others, who cannot tolerate others being competent because it threatens their identity as the special one. The leader who needs to be seen as visionary hero, who surrounds themselves with weak followers, who cannot share power because it would contradict the hero narrative, the activist who is more invested in being seen as fighting injustice than in actually creating change. The false hero also manifests as what Jung called the puer aeternus, the eternal boy who refuses to grow up, who wants the glory of heroism without its sacrifice, who seeks adventure but avoids commitment, who identifies with potential rather than with actuality. The puer remains always preparing for the great deed, always on the verge of becoming who they might be, but never actually doing the difficult work of development, never facing the trials that would transform potential into actuality. Jung warned that identification with the hero archetype prevents genuine heroism because the person becomes concerned with appearing heroic, with maintaining the hero persona, with proving their specialness rather than with doing what actually needs to be done. True heroism is unconscious of itself, does what is necessary without needing recognition, serves something larger without requiring that service enhance ego. The antidote to false heroism is humility, recognizing that the heroic capacity belongs to the archetype, not to the individual ego, that we are instruments through which the hero acts rather than heroes ourselves, that genuine heroism serves life rather than serving our need to feel special. The inner hero, everyday heroism and individuation. The hero's journey is not only mythological but psychological, not only for legendary figures but for every person who faces the challenges of development, who confronts their own shadow, who undertakes the difficult work of becoming conscious. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward wholeness, toward integration of all aspects of the psyche, toward becoming fully oneself rather than simply what others expect or what culture demands. Individuation requires everyday heroism, the courage to face not dramatic external enemies but internal resistances, not to slay dragons but to confront the parts of ourselves we have rejected, not to rescue kingdoms but to rescue our own authenticity from the demands of persona and collective. This heroism is quieter than mythological heroism, less visible, less celebrated, but equally difficult and equally necessary. The everyday hero is the person who leaves the security of a career that no longer fits, who risks disapproval to live according to their own values, who faces their addiction or their trauma or their fear rather than continuing to avoid it. They are the parent who does the difficult work of seeing their child clearly rather than through projection, the person who stays in therapy when it becomes painful, the individual who questions beliefs they inherited without examination. This heroism does not involve conquering others but conquering oneself, not defeating external enemies but integrating internal shadow, not achieving glory but achieving authenticity. The trials are daily. The choice to be honest when lying would be easier, the willingness to be vulnerable when defended would be safer, the courage to act according to conscience when conformity would be more comfortable. The treasure at the end of this journey is not external reward but internal wholeness, not acclaim from others but integrity with oneself, not power over the world but mastery of one's own development. The person who completes this journey does not become perfect or transcendent but becomes genuinely themselves, becomes capable of living from their own center rather than from borrowed values, becomes free in the only way freedom is actually possible, through conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. Jung believed that the hero archetype guides this process, provides the pattern, shows the stages through which consciousness must pass. The call to adventure is the recognition that one must change. The trials are the resistances encountered in that change. The death and rebirth is the transformation that occurs when old identity dissolves and new identity emerges. The return is bringing this transformation into everyday life, living the new consciousness, serving the community with what has been learned. The hero within is not waiting to be discovered but is already active, is calling us toward development, toward challenges that will transform us, toward the journey that each person must make to become who they actually are rather than who they have been told to be. Conclusion: The psychology of the hero archetype reveals that heroism is not reserved for legendary figures, but is the birthright and the challenge of every human being who seeks to develop, to become conscious, to live authentically rather than according to scripts written by others. The hero's journey is not one journey taken once, but the pattern of transformation that repeats throughout life, each time requiring courage, requiring sacrifice, requiring willingness to die to who we have been, so that who we might become can emerge. Jung understood that the hero represents a crucial stage in psychological development, the ego's establishment of independence from the unconscious, the differentiation of individual identity from collective identity. But he also recognized the dangers of this archetype, the inflation that occurs when ego identifies with hero rather than relating to the heroic pattern, the false heroism that seeks glory rather than service, the poor psychology that wants adventure without commitment. True heroism is not about being special, but about doing what is necessary, not about conquering others, but about confronting oneself, not about achieving external success, but about achieving internal integration. It requires facing the shadow, the monster, the dragon that guards the treasure, recognizing that these apparent enemies are actually rejected aspects of ourselves that must be integrated for wholeness to be achieved. The hero must die, must sacrifice the ego's claim to centrality, must surrender the demand that life conform to our desires, must accept that transformation requires loss as well as gain. This death is not literal but psychological, not the end of ego but its transformation from master to servant, from center to participant in something larger. The treasure gained through this sacrifice is not power or glory but wholeness, not superiority but authenticity, not transcendence but the capacity to live fully and consciously as oneself. The person who completes the hero's journey returns to ordinary life, changed, brings back gifts that serve the community, lives from a deeper center, acts with greater consciousness, but the journey is never complete. Each stage of life presents new calls to adventure, new trials, new monsters, new deaths, and rebirths. The hero archetype is not pattern we move through once, but pattern that structures development throughout the lifespan, that guides us through each transition, that shows us how transformation occurs. Modern life still requires heroes, not the inflated heroes who need recognition and glory, but the everyday heroes who do the difficult work of becoming conscious, of facing their shadow, of living authentically despite pressure to conform. These are the people who question rather than accept, who risk rather than play safe, who choose growth over comfort, who say yes to the journey even when the outcome is uncertain. The call to adventure comes to everyone. Most refuse it, prefer the familiar prison to the unknown freedom, choose the safety of unconsciousness over the risk of awareness. But some answer the call, cross the threshold, face the trials, die and are reborn, return transformed. These are the everyday heroes, the individuals who undertake the journey toward wholeness, who serve the self rather than only the ego, who become consciously what they already are, unconsciously. Understanding the psychology of the hero archetype means recognizing this pattern in ourselves, seeing where we have refused the call, identifying the trials we face, acknowledging the deaths we must undergo, claiming the treasures we have earned. It means not identifying as hero, but recognizing the heroic journey as the structure of our development, the map of how consciousness grows, the pattern through which we become fully human. The hero within is not separate from us, but is us in our highest potential, not what we might achieve, but what we might become, not destination, but journey, not arrival, but continuous development toward wholeness, toward consciousness, toward the self that includes all we are and all we might be. If this exploration of the hero archetype has helped you recognize the journey you are on, the calls you have refused or answered, the trials you face, the deaths you must undergo, then you have begun to see your life through archetypal lens, to recognize the patterns that structure development, to understand that your struggles are not random, but are part of the universal pattern of transformation. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that explores Jungian psychology and archetypal patterns with depth and nuance, that honors mythology as psychological truth, that recognizes the hero's journey as the structure of development rather than as entertainment. Share this with someone who needs to understand that their struggles are meaningful, that their trials are part of transformation, that the journey they resist is the journey they need. Leave a comment sharing your own hero's journey, the calls you have answered or refused, the trials you have faced, the monsters you have confronted, the deaths you have undergone, the treasures you have found. This community exists for those who recognize that life is journey, not destination, that development requires sacrifice, that becoming whole requires facing what we have rejected. Remember, you are not called to be a legendary hero, not required to slay literal dragons or rescue kingdoms. You are called to face your own shadow, to undertake your own development, to answer the call to adventure that comes in the form of your own life's challenges and transitions. This is the heroism that matters, the courage that transforms, the journey that makes us fully human. The call to adventure is always there, waiting for your answer. Most refuse it, choose safety over growth, choose the known over the unknown. But you can answer the call, can cross the threshold, can face the trials, can allow the necessary deaths, can claim the treasures. The hero's journey is not something that happened to others in other times. It is happening now, to you, in the ordinary challenges of becoming conscious, of facing yourself, of living authentically. Answer the call, face the trials, allow the transformation, return with the gifts. This is the hero's journey, and it is yours.